If someone had asked me a year ago how my marriage was, I probably would have said it was fine. Not great, not terrible, just fine. Rachel and I had been married for 15 years, and somewhere along the way, the spark we once had dimmed. It wasn't that we didn't love each other. It was more like life had worn us down. I'm Matt, 40 years old, a marketing executive with a knack for strategy but not much left over for spontaneity. My wife, Rachel, is 38 and a freelance photographer. She's creative, driven, and endlessly passionate about her work. It's one of the things I've always admired about her, even when it meant she'd get lost in her projects for days at a time. We live a comfortable life in a quiet suburb, a nice house, a decent income, no major worries. But over the past few years, our relationship had settled into a routine that felt more like cohabitation than a partnership. I was busy with work, and Rachel was constantly chasing the next gig or creative inspiration. Our conversations had dwindled to logistics and pleasantries, and our date nights had become rare, obligatory affairs. It was Rachel who suggested the trip. "We need this, Matt," she said one evening, her tone earnest. "A real vacation. Just the two of us. No work, no distractions, just time to reconnect." She wasn't wrong. We hadn't been on a proper vacation in years. Between her unpredictable schedule and my demanding job, we barely had time to breathe, let alone focus on each other. So, we booked a week at a luxurious resort in the mountains, a place with scenic views, cozy cabins, and the promise of peace and quiet. Rachel was especially excited about the photography opportunities, and I hoped the change of scenery might help us find our way back to each other. When we arrived, I was struck by how beautiful the place was. The resort was nestled in a valley, surrounded by towering trees and snow-capped peaks. Our cabin was charming and secluded, with a private balcony overlooking a sparkling lake. Rachel seemed happier than I'd seen her in months. She wandered around the cabin with her camera, snapping photos of the view and gushing about the natural light. Her enthusiasm was contagious, and for the first time in a while, I felt a glimmer of hope that this trip could bring us closer. But beneath the surface, there was an unspoken tension. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, just a nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. Maybe it was the way Rachel's smiles didn't always reach her eyes, or how she seemed more preoccupied than usual. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just overthinking. After all, this trip was supposed to be about letting go of stress and enjoying each other's company. But as the days went on, that uneasy feeling only grew stronger. The first couple of days at the resort felt like a tentative step in the right direction. Rachel and I explored the trails, shared meals by the fireplace, and even laughed about some of the silly tourists we saw trying to hike in dress shoes. It wasn't perfect, but it was something, a reminder of how things used to be. Then, her behavior started to change. It began with her phone. Rachel had always been attached to it, she used it for her photography work and stayed connected with clients through social media, but on this trip, it felt different. She seemed to be on it constantly, her fingers flying across the screen with an intensity that didn't match her usual scrolling habits. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off. "Just emails," she said, flashing me a quick smile before turning back to her phone. I didn't think much of it at first. Rachel was always juggling projects, even when we were supposed to be relaxing. But her phone never left her side, and she started stepping outside to take calls, claiming they were work-related. One afternoon, I suggested we rent bikes and explore the nearby trails. It was the kind of spontaneous activity we hadn't done in years. "I'd love to," Rachel said, glancing at her watch. "But I need some time to shoot. The light is perfect right now." I didn't argue. Photography was her passion, and I wanted her to enjoy herself. "Where are you going to shoot?" I asked casually. "Oh, just around," she said, a little too vaguely. She grabbed her camera bag and left without another word, leaving me alone in the cabin. As the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Rachel had always been precise about her shoots, meticulously planning locations and schedules. But this time, she'd left without any clear direction. When she returned just before sunset, she seemed distracted. I asked her how it went, and she gave me a vague answer about getting some good shots before disappearing into the bathroom. That night, I lay awake, replaying the day in my mind. Rachel's behavior was unusual, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe she really was focused on her photography, or maybe she just needed space. The next morning, I suggested we spend the day at the spa, a couple's massage, a soak in the hot springs, something to help us unwind. Rachel hesitated, biting her lip. That sounds nice, but I was thinking of heading into town. There's a market there, and I thought I could get some shots of the locals. I could come with you, I offered. Her eyes flickered briefly with something I couldn't quite place, nervousness, maybe. It's probably not your thing, she said quickly. I'll just be wandering around, and I don't want to bore you. Her excuse didn't sit well with me, but I didn't push. I told myself I was being paranoid, that Rachel deserved her space. But as I watched her leave the cabin again, that nagging feeling in my chest grew stronger. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. Rachel's behavior over the next couple of days left me with more questions than answers. Her trips into town became a daily ritual, each one accompanied by a vague explanation about photography or inspiration. At first, I convinced myself to be supportive. After all, this was supposed to be a vacation to recharge and reconnect. But instead of bringing us closer, it felt like Rachel was drifting further away. One afternoon, I decided to return to the cabin early after a solo hike. The plan was to surprise Rachel, maybe catch her relaxing on the balcony or editing photos. Instead, I walked into a scene that made my stomach twist. The first thing I noticed was the faint smell of wine. That wasn't unusual, Rachel loved winding down with a glass in the evenings, but it was the middle of the day. My eyes landed on the coffee table, where two glasses sat, one with lipstick smudged on the rim, and the other half empty. I looked around the room, my pulse quickening. The bed was slightly undone, though I hadn't touched it since the morning. A jacket was draped over the chair near the window, but it wasn't mine, or Rachel's. My first thought was that maybe a neighbor or staff member had stopped by for something. But why would they? And why would Rachel have hidden it from me? I sat down, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My gaze fell on the dresser, where Rachel's camera bag sat. Usually, she was meticulous about unpacking her gear, but this time it was zipped closed. On a whim, I opened it, expecting to find her usual lenses and memory cards. Instead, there was a receipt tucked inside. It was from a nearby restaurant, time-stamped from the night before, when Rachel had said she was taking sunset shots by the lake. The receipt listed 2 entrees, a bottle of wine, and a dessert. My chest tightened as I stared at it. Rachel hadn't mentioned going out to eat. We'd been planning to cook together that night, but she'd returned late, claiming she'd lost track of time. A sickening thought crept into my mind, but I pushed it aside. No, it couldn't be. When Rachel returned that evening, she seemed her usual self, chatting about the market and the people she'd photographed. But as I watched her, my unease deepened. Her smile seemed forced, her laughter hollow. I couldn't bring myself to confront her, not yet. Instead, I decided to dig deeper. The next day, I told Rachel I wanted to sleep in while she went about her usual plans. She seemed relieved, almost eager, as she grabbed her camera bag and headed out the door. As soon as she left, I searched the cabin, looking for anything that might explain what was going on. At first, I found nothing out of the ordinary: clothes, toiletries, her usual travel essentials. But then I found her phone. It was sitting on the nightstand, locked, but I knew the passcode. I hesitated, my heart pounding. This felt like crossing a line, but the doubt and suspicion were too overwhelming to ignore. When I unlocked it, I immediately went to her messages. Most of them were innocent: conversations with friends, clients, and family. But one thread was different. It was from someone saved as J. I opened it, and the messages confirmed what I'd been dreading. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. The wine was perfect, but the company was even better. Meet me at the park tomorrow. Usual spot. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the thread. The texts painted a picture I didn't want to believe. Rachel was meeting someone. Here. On the very trip meant to save our marriage. I put the phone down, my mind reeling. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately, to demand answers. But another part of me, the part still clinging to the hope that I was wrong, needed more proof. That night, as Rachel sat across from me at dinner, chatting about her day, I couldn't focus on her words. All I could see was the evidence I'd found. All I could hear were the words from those messages. I didn't sleep that night. The betrayal I'd uncovered felt like a physical weight, pressing down on me, stealing the air from my lungs. The woman I thought I knew, the life I thought we'd built together, was unraveling before my eyes. And I wasn't sure how much more I could take. The next morning, I woke up with a single goal in mind, to confirm my suspicions once and for all. I felt like a stranger in my own marriage, stuck in a cruel limbo between denial and heartbreak. If Rachel was truly betraying me, I needed to see it with my own eyes. Over breakfast, Rachel seemed distracted. She scrolled through her phone, occasionally smiling at something on the screen. I'm heading out again today, she said casually, setting her coffee cup down. I want to explore the trails near the park and get some shots of the morning light. I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral. Sounds good. I think I'll hang back and relax for a bit. Her face softened with relief, and she quickly packed her camera bag before leaving. Once she was gone, I grabbed my jacket and slipped out the door. I knew from the messages I'd read on her phone that she planned to meet Jay at the park. It was a short walk from the resort, a picturesque spot with winding paths, benches, and plenty of secluded corners. I kept my distance as I followed her, my heart pounding with every step. When we reached the park, Rachel walked to a small clearing near the edge of the woods. She looked around briefly before sitting on a bench, her camera resting in her lap. A few minutes later, a man approached her. He was tall, with dark hair and an easy smile. Rachel's face lit up when she saw him, a smile that wasn't meant for me. They greeted each other warmly, too warmly, and sat close together on the bench. I watched from a distance, my stomach churning as they talked and laughed like old friends. At one point, he reached out and touched her arm, a gesture that felt far too intimate. Rachel didn't pull away. The sight of them together was like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just some innocent meeting. This was something more, something I wasn't a part of. I stayed hidden, watching as they talked for what felt like an eternity. Eventually, they stood and began walking along the trail, side by side, their shoulders brushing occasionally. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and walked back to the cabin, my mind racing. When Rachel returned later that afternoon, she acted as if nothing was wrong. She showed me a few photos on her camera, landscapes, close-ups of flowers, the usual subjects she loved to capture. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice light and casual. "Uneventful," I said, forcing a smile. "Yours?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying. "Productive. I think I got some great shots." Her lie felt like a slap in the face. That evening, I couldn't sit still. The weight of what I'd seen, combined with Rachel's attempt to hide it, was too much to bear. I paced the cabin, replaying the events of the day in my mind. Around midnight, I finally confronted her. "Rachel," I said, standing in the doorway of the bedroom where she was getting ready for bed. "Who's Jay?" She froze, her face going pale. "What?" "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "I saw the messages on your phone." I saw you with him today at the park. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For a moment, I thought she might try to deny it, but then her shoulders sagged, and she sank onto the edge of the bed. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sorry. I repeated, my voice rising. You're sorry. That's all you have to say. Tears filled her eyes as she looked up at me. It's not what you think. Then explain it to me, I demanded. Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what I think. She hesitated, her hands trembling in her lap. I never meant for it to happen, she said finally. It was a mistake. A mistake. I shot back. Meeting him in secret, lying to me, those were mistakes. Rachel broke down then, sobbing into her hands. I felt so alone, she said through her tears. We've been so distant, Matt. I didn't know how to fix it, and he made me feel noticed, appreciated. Her words cut deep, but I couldn't decide if I felt angrier at her or myself. Had I truly been so blind to her unhappiness? Or was this just an excuse for her betrayal? I trusted you, I said quietly, the weight of it all crashing down on me. And you threw it all away. Rachel reached for my hand, but I stepped back, shaking my head. Don't, I said. I can't do this right now. I left the room, leaving her alone with her guilt and my shattered trust. As I sat on the couch, staring at nothing, one thing became painfully clear: whatever was left of our marriage had been irreparably damaged. And I didn't know if it could ever be repaired. The hours after our confrontation were some of the longest of my life. I sat in the dark living room, replaying Rachel's words over and over in my mind. I felt so alone. He made me feel noticed. I didn't know whether to be angry or devastated. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Had I really been so absent that she'd felt invisible? Or was she just making excuses to justify what she'd done? The resort cabin that had once seemed cozy and inviting now felt suffocating. Every corner of the room reminded me of the trip we'd planned to save our marriage, the meals we'd cooked together, the quiet mornings on the balcony, the laughter we'd shared. It all felt like a cruel joke now, tainted by the betrayal I couldn't unsee. Rachel didn't come out of the bedroom. I could hear her muffled sobs through the door, but I didn't go to her. I didn't have it in me to comfort her, not after what she'd done. When the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, I still hadn't slept. I finally stood, my legs stiff and my head pounding, and stepped outside. The cool mountain air hit me like a slap, but it was a welcome distraction from the storm raging in my chest. I walked aimlessly along the trails, my thoughts circling back to the same point: where had it all gone wrong? 15 years of marriage, and somehow we'd ended up here. I thought about the early days of our relationship, the excitement of building a life together. We'd been so in sync back then, so sure of each other. But over time, life had crept in: work, responsibilities, the endless grind of daily routines. We'd stopped trying, stopped noticing each other. And now, this. By the time I returned to the cabin, Rachel was awake. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes red and swollen. She looked up when I came in, her expression a mixture of guilt and fear. Matt, she started, her voice shaky. Can we talk? I hesitated, then nodded, sitting across from her. I don't know how to fix this, she said, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. But I want to try. I want to make things right. Her words sounded genuine, but they didn't ease the ache in my chest. How am I supposed to trust you again? I asked, my voice low. Rachel flinched, tears welling in her eyes. I don't know, she admitted. But I'll do whatever it takes. I'll end things with him, I already have. I'll go to counseling. I'll do anything. Just, please don't give up on us. Her desperation was palpable, but I couldn't bring myself to feel hopeful. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. It wasn't something that could be rebuilt at all if the foundation was this broken. I don't know if I can, I said finally, my voice breaking. You didn't just hurt me, Rachel. You destroyed everything I thought we had. She reached across the table, but I pulled back, standing abruptly. I need some time to think, I said, walking out the door before she could respond. I spent the rest of the day wandering the resort grounds, lost in my thoughts. The love I still felt for Rachel warred with the anger and betrayal threatening to consume me. Could I forgive her? Did I even want to try? By the time the sun began to set, I still didn't have any answers. All I knew was that the road ahead was going to be long, painful, and uncertain. That evening, I returned to the cabin, emotionally drained from the weight of the day. Rachel was sitting on the couch, staring at the unlit fireplace, her camera resting beside her. She looked up when I walked in, her expression hesitant, as if she wasn't sure whether I wanted to talk. I didn't, not really, but the silence between us was unbearable. I don't know what you expect me to do, I said finally, sitting down in a chair across from her. I just want a chance to make this right, she replied, her voice trembling. I know I've hurt you, Matt. More than I can even put into words. But I love you. And I don't want to lose what we've built together. Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Part of me wanted to believe her, to cling to the hope that we could fix what was broken. But another part of me couldn't forget the image of her with someone else, couldn't erase the betrayal. How do I know this isn't just guilt talking? I asked. How do I know you're not saying all of this because you're afraid of the consequences? Rachel shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Because I've been afraid for so long, afraid of admitting how lost I felt, afraid of hurting you, afraid of ruining everything. And I still managed to do all of that. But now I just want to be honest, even if it's painful. She reached for her camera, pulling out the memory card. I've been taking photos this whole trip, trying to capture something meaningful, but all I see in them is how far apart we've drifted. I didn't see it until now. I didn't want to see it. She handed me the card, her hands shaking. Look at them, if you want. They're proof of how much I've been trying to avoid facing the truth. I didn't take the card. Instead, I looked at her, searching her face for any sign of deceit. All I saw was regret, raw and unfiltered. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But I'll give us the chance to figure it out. Her eyes widened in surprise, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of hope in her expression. Thank you, she said, her voice breaking. I promise I'll do whatever it takes, Matt. I'll cut ties with him completely. I'll be an open book. Just tell me what you need. I need time, I replied. And I need honesty. No more secrets. Rachel nodded, wiping her tears away. No more secrets, she repeated. That night, we slept in the same bed for the first time since the confrontation. It wasn't the same, it couldn't be, but it felt like a step toward something. Whether that something was repair or closure, I didn't know. In the morning, Rachel suggested we visit one of the resort's counselors, someone who specialized in helping couples. At first, I resisted the idea. The thought of sharing our deeply personal issues with a stranger made my skin crawl. But Rachel's willingness to take accountability and fight for us convinced me to give it a try. The counselor, a warm woman named Dr. Haynes, welcomed us into her office, a cozy room filled with soft lighting and calming decor. She listened as we each shared our side of the story, Rachel's feelings of loneliness and neglect, my sense of betrayal and loss. There's no quick fix for this, Dr. Haynes said gently. Rebuilding trust takes time, effort, and vulnerability from both of you. The question is whether you're both willing to do the work. Rachel nodded emphatically. I am, she said. I'll do whatever it takes. I hesitated, the weight of my doubts pressing down on me. But finally, I nodded. I'll try, I said. Dr. Haynes gave us tools to start the process, ways to communicate more openly, exercises to rebuild intimacy, and strategies to address the underlying issues in our marriage. Over the next few days, Rachel and I began putting those tools into practice. We talked, really talked, for the first time in years, sharing fears, frustrations, and hopes we hadn't dared to voice before. It wasn't easy. Every conversation felt like walking a tightrope, the tension between us threatening to snap at any moment. But amidst the pain and uncertainty, there were small moments of connection, glimpses of the bond we once had. We shared a quiet dinner on the balcony one evening, watching the sun dip below the mountains. Rachel reached for my hand, and for the first time, I didn't pull away. "It's a start," I said, my voice soft. "It is," she agreed. And for the first time in days, I felt something other than anger and sadness. I felt hope. The days following our first counseling session were filled with tension, but they were also surprisingly productive. Rachel and I started spending more time together, not because we felt obligated but because we were beginning to rediscover how to talk to each other. It wasn't perfect, far from it. There were moments when the anger and betrayal bubbled back to the surface, threatening to derail our progress. But for the first time in years, I felt like we were truly confronting the issues that had been festering in our marriage. Rachel took the lead in rebuilding trust. She deleted all contact with Jason in front of me, showing me the messages before removing his number and blocking him on every platform. It didn't erase what had happened, but it was a step toward transparency. "I don't want there to be any doubts," she said, her voice steady. "I want you to know that I'm committed to us." I wanted to believe her. Part of me did. But the scars of her betrayal weren't so easily soothed. We continued our sessions with Dr. Haynes, who helped us navigate the tangled emotions we were both experiencing. Rachel opened up about her feelings of loneliness and how she'd let those emotions push her toward Jason. "I'm not excusing what I did," she said during one session. "But I want Matt to understand that it wasn't about him. It was about me feeling lost and not knowing how to ask for help." Her honesty stung, but it also gave me a new perspective. I realized that I hadn't been as present in our marriage as I thought I had. My focus on work, my tendency to retreat into routines, I'd let those things come between us without even noticing. That evening, Rachel and I decided to take a break from the heavy conversations and do something lighthearted. We rented bikes from the resort and spent the afternoon exploring the trails. For the first time since arriving, I saw Rachel's genuine smile. Not the forced, polite one she'd been wearing since the confrontation, but the carefree grin I remembered from our early years together. We stopped at a small clearing overlooking the lake, where Rachel pulled out her camera and started snapping photos. She turned the lens on me, laughing when I tried to block my face. "Come on, Matt," she said, her tone playful. "You used to love being in my pictures." I lowered my hand, letting her take the shot. "Fine," I said, rolling my eyes. "But you'd better make me look good." Rachel lowered the camera, her expression softening. "You always look good to me," she said quietly. Her words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. But as we stood there, the tension between us seemed to ease, replaced by something lighter, something closer to what we used to have. That night, we shared a bottle of wine on the balcony, watching the stars come out. Rachel leaned against my shoulder, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't pull away. "Do you think we'll ever get back to where we were?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought about it for a long moment before answering. "I don't know if we can," I admitted. "But maybe we can build something new. Something better." Rachel nodded, her hand finding mine. "I'd like that," she said. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a step. And for the first time since the trip began, I felt like we were heading in the right direction. "You said." "Then." As the days passed, Rachel and I began to settle into a tentative rhythm. The emotional wounds were still fresh, but the small moments of connection we were building gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Rachel was putting in the effort, and I could see it in everything she did. She made it a point to spend her mornings with me, whether it was sharing a quiet cup of coffee on the balcony or walking the resort trails hand in hand. Her phone, once an ever-present barrier between us, was now a forgotten object on the nightstand. Our second counseling session with Dr. Haynes felt different. Rachel was more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her, openly admitting her flaws and the mistakes she'd made. When I met Jason, it wasn't about love or a connection, she said, her voice trembling. It was about filling a void I didn't know how to talk about. I thought I needed excitement, but what I really needed was to feel seen. And I see now that I didn't give Matt the chance to help me. I betrayed him instead. Her words resonated with me, though they didn't erase the pain. But hearing her take responsibility, acknowledging the depth of her betrayal, made me feel like we were finally facing our problems instead of avoiding them. Dr. Haynes guided us through exercises to rebuild trust, focusing on open communication and small acts of transparency. Rachel embraced it wholeheartedly, sharing her thoughts and feelings without hesitation. One evening, as we sat by the fire in our cabin, she surprised me by pulling out a small notebook. "I've been writing down things I want us to do together," she said, her cheeks tinged with embarrassment. "Things to reconnect us." I flipped through the pages, smiling at her ideas: a weekend road trip, a cooking class, taking ballroom dancing lessons. Ballroom dancing? I teased, raising an eyebrow. Rachel laughed, her cheeks reddening. "I thought it might be fun," she said. "And maybe a little symbolic. A new way to move forward together." The gesture touched me more than I expected. It wasn't just a list, it was a commitment to us. The next day, we spent the afternoon kayaking on the lake, something Rachel had always wanted to try. At first, it felt awkward, both of us unsure of how to paddle in sync. But as the hours passed, we found our rhythm, laughing as we splashed each other and drifted toward the shore. Later, we had dinner at the resort's restaurant, sharing a meal that felt like our first real date in years. Rachel looked at me across the table, her eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time: genuine love. "I know I can't undo what I've done," she said softly. "But I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." Her words stayed with me as we returned to the cabin. That night, as we lay in bed, I reached for her hand, lacing my fingers with hers. "I'm still hurt," I said quietly. "But I'm willing to try. For us." Rachel squeezed my hand, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Thank you." For the first time in weeks, I felt like we were on solid ground. The pain of her betrayal wasn't gone, but it was beginning to fade, replaced by something fragile but real: the possibility of a new beginning. Returning home after the trip felt like stepping into a different world. The cabin, the mountains, and the quiet isolation had been a cocoon where Rachel and I could focus solely on us. But now, back in our daily lives, the real test began. The first few days were difficult. Rachel was visibly anxious, constantly checking to make sure I was okay. I, in turn, struggled to balance the tentative hope I felt with the lingering pain of her betrayal. Trust didn't rebuild itself overnight, and every small sign of progress felt precarious, like it could crumble at any moment. But Rachel didn't falter. She kept her promises, attending counseling sessions with me and going to individual therapy on her own. She gave me full access to her phone and email, not as a way to invite surveillance, but as a demonstration of her transparency. "I want you to feel secure," she said. "I have nothing to hide anymore." Her actions spoke louder than her words. One evening, as we were making dinner together, something we hadn't done in years, I realized how much had changed. Rachel was different. She was present in a way I hadn't seen in a long time, laughing at my bad jokes and brushing flour off my face with a playful smile. It wasn't just her. I was different, too. The trip had forced me to confront my own role in our drifting apart. I had let my work and routines consume me, leaving little room for the spontaneity and connection that Rachel had always thrived on. I started making small changes, carving out time for her and for us. We set aside one evening a week for date night, alternating between simple dinners at home and outings to places we'd always meant to visit. One Saturday, Rachel pulled out the list she'd made during our trip. "How about ballroom dancing?" she suggested, her eyes twinkling with mischief. I groaned dramatically, but I couldn't hide my grin. "Only if you promise not to laugh at my two left feet," I said. "I make no promises," she replied, giggling. The lessons were a disaster at first. I stepped on her toes more times than I could count, and we spent more time laughing than dancing. But as the weeks went on, we found a rhythm, not just on the dance floor but in our relationship. Our counseling sessions became less about repairing damage and more about deepening our connection. Dr. Haynes guided us through conversations we'd never had before, about our dreams, our fears, and the things we loved most about each other. For me, those sessions were a turning point. They reminded me of why I'd fallen in love with Rachel in the first place: her passion, her creativity, her ability to see beauty in the smallest details. One evening, as we sat on the porch of our home, Rachel handed me a photo. It was one she'd taken during our trip, a candid shot of me gazing out at the lake. "I printed this for you," she said, her voice soft. "It's my favorite picture from the trip because it reminds me of what I almost lost." I stared at the photo, my chest tightening. "We've come a long way," I said. "And we'll keep going," she replied, taking my hand. For the first time since the affair, I believed her. The months that followed were a slow, steady climb towards something new. The wounds of Rachel's betrayal hadn't fully healed, but the foundation of trust was being rebuilt, one small, deliberate step at a time. Rachel made good on her promises, her actions consistently backing up her words. She stopped taking on excessive freelance projects that had previously consumed her time and focus. Instead, she carved out space for us, for moments that reinforced our connection. On one occasion, I found her in the living room, sorting through old photo albums. She looked up and smiled. "I thought we could go through these together," she said. "Remember where we started?" We spent the evening flipping through snapshots of our life, our wedding day, vacations, birthdays, and silly candid moments. It reminded me of how much we'd shared, how much was still worth saving. Our weekly counseling sessions evolved, becoming less about addressing past mistakes and more about nurturing a future we both wanted. Dr. Haynes challenged us to find new ways to surprise each other, to express gratitude in the small, everyday gestures that often go unnoticed. I started leaving Rachel little notes on the fridge, nothing fancy, just words of encouragement or reminders of how much I appreciated her. She responded in kind, slipping handwritten messages into my work bag or cooking my favorite meals on particularly stressful days. One weekend, Rachel suggested we take a short road trip to a nearby vineyard. It was a spontaneous idea, the kind of thing we hadn't done in years. As we drove through winding country roads, singing along to old songs on the radio, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. At the vineyard, we spent hours sampling wine, laughing at each other's attempts to describe the flavors. It felt like a reset button, a reminder that we could still have fun together, that we were capable of building new memories. Back home, I started to notice other changes. Rachel had developed a habit of pausing to ask, "How was your day?" Not as a casual question, but as an invitation to share, to connect. And I found myself doing the same, realizing how much I'd taken her presence for granted in the past. One night, as we were getting ready for bed, Rachel looked at me and said, "I don't want you to think I'm forgetting what happened. I'm not. I think about it every day, and I'll never stop being sorry for what I did. But I hope you can see how much I'm trying to be better." I sat beside her, taking her hand in mine. "I do," I said honestly. "And I'm trying, too. I know I wasn't perfect, Rachel. I could have done more, been more present. But I want this to work as much as you do." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't from sadness. They were from relief, from hope. As we lay in bed that night, her head resting on my chest, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. It wasn't complete, and it wasn't constant, but it was enough to keep moving forward. For the first time, I believed that our marriage could survive, not as it was before, but as something stronger, something built on a foundation of honesty, forgiveness, and mutual effort. Brick by brick, we were rebuilding. And for the first time in a long time, the future felt bright. As the weeks turned into months, Rachel and I found ourselves settling into a new version of our relationship. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without its challenges, but it felt real, stronger than it had been in years. One of the most profound changes was the way we communicated. We no longer tiptoed around difficult topics or let frustrations simmer beneath the surface. Instead, we talked openly, even when it was uncomfortable. "I still have bad days," I admitted one evening as we sat on the couch, the soft glow of a lamp casting long shadows across the room. "Sometimes I think about what happened, and it hurts all over again." Rachel reached for my hand, her expression solemn. "I understand," she said quietly. "I have bad days too, days when I hate myself for what I did. But I'm here, Matt. I'm not going anywhere." Her reassurance didn't erase the pain, but it made me feel less alone. And that, I realized, was a victory in itself. Our counseling sessions had shifted focus, moving away from the affair and toward building a shared future. Dr. Haynes encouraged us to dream together, to think about what we wanted our lives to look like in 5, 10, or 20 years. "We've talked a lot about rebuilding trust," Dr. Haynes said during one session. "But what about joy? What are the things that make you happy as a couple? How can you create more of those moments?" The question stayed with me. For so long, our marriage had been about routine and responsibility, about checking boxes and getting through the day. But now, we had a chance to rediscover what brought us joy. We started small, spontaneous trips to the farmer's market, lazy Sunday mornings with pancakes and music, late-night walks under the stars. Each moment felt like a thread, weaving a new tapestry of memories to replace the ones that had been frayed by betrayal. Rachel's passion for photography became a shared experience. She started teaching me the basics, handing me her spare camera and guiding me through composition and lighting. "You've got a good eye," she said one afternoon as we reviewed my photos of a local park. "Beginner's luck," I replied with a laugh. "No, really," she insisted, her smile genuine. "You're better at this than you think." Her encouragement felt like a gift, a reminder that we could still build each other up instead of tearing each other down. The ballroom dancing lessons were another unexpected source of connection. What started as a clumsy attempt to follow the instructor's steps had evolved into something more fluid, more intuitive. "Who knew you had such rhythm?" Rachel teased one evening as we practiced in the living room, the furniture pushed aside to create a makeshift dance floor. "Don't get used to it," I joked, spinning her clumsily but earning a laugh in the process. These moments weren't just fun, they were healing. They reminded us of who we were as individuals and as partners, of the love that had brought us together in the first place. By the time our 6-month anniversary of reconciliation rolled around, I felt something I hadn't dared to hope for: peace. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't always easy, but it was ours. We were building a life that was honest, intentional, and full of possibilities. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Rachel turned to me and said, "I never thought we'd get here. But I'm so grateful we did." I nodded, my heart full. "Me too," I said. In that moment, I realized something important: we weren't just rebuilding what we'd lost. We were creating something entirely new, something even better than before. Sitting here now, months removed from that trip and everything it revealed, I can finally see the journey for what it was: painful, necessary, and transformative. I won't lie and say that what Rachel did doesn't still hurt. There are moments when the memory of her betrayal creeps in, uninvited and unwelcome. But those moments are fewer now, and they no longer have the power to consume me. The truth is, the affair forced us to confront things we've been avoiding for years. It uncovered cracks in our marriage that we hadn't wanted to see, cracks that might have widened into an irreparable chasm if we hadn't faced them head-on. Rachel and I are different people than we were before, stronger, more honest, more present. We've learned how to listen to each other, how to speak openly without fear of judgment or rejection. It hasn't been easy, and there were times when I didn't think we'd make it. But we did. The trip that almost ended our marriage became the turning point that saved it. One evening, not long ago, Rachel and I sat down to talk about the future. It wasn't a planned conversation, just one of those moments that happened naturally, the kind that reminded me of how we used to be. "We should plan another trip," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. "Not to escape, but to celebrate how far we've come." "Where do you want to go?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "Somewhere new," she said. "Someplace we've never been. A fresh start." Her words resonated with me. That's exactly what our marriage had become, a fresh start. As we sat there, tossing around ideas for our next adventure, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't dwelling on the past or worrying about the future. I was simply present, enjoying the moment with the woman I'd chosen to stay with, the woman who had chosen to stay and fight for us. Looking back, I see now that Rachel's betrayal wasn't the end of our story. It was a chapter, painful, yes, but also pivotal. It taught us the importance of communication, of making time for each other, of not taking our relationship for granted. It reminded me that love isn't static. It's a choice we make every day, in the big decisions and the small gestures. And as hard as it was to face what happened, I'm proud of the choice we made to keep going. As I write this, Rachel is in the other room, editing photos for a new project. I can hear her humming softly, a sound that fills the house with warmth. It's a sound I might have overlooked before, but now, it's a reminder of how far we've come. Our marriage isn't perfect, no relationship ever is. But it's real, and it's ours. And for the first time in a long time, I feel hopeful about the future. We've survived the storm, and now we're standing in the sunlight. Together.